Well, joining me now are three MPs from the different parties. Andrew Leslie is the Liberal MP for the Ottawa riding of Orleans, and he's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Aaron O'Toole is the Conservative MP for the Ontario riding of Durham, and he's his party's Foreign Affairs critic. And Daniel Blaikie is the NDP MP for the Winnipeg riding of Elmwood-Transcona. All three of you, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with NAFTA. This is a moving target. We are seeing some very intense negotiations going on in Washington as we speak. I'll start with you, Andrew Leslie. What should we be watching for? The Minister, Freeland, says there is progress being made and quite an amount of progress. What should we watch for?
I think this last week or so has been of a special intensity to the extent to where the teams are now essentially working almost 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there has been a lot of good progress. There's still lots to do, but in terms of the rate of progression this last week has been, as the Minister said, good.
Okay, one of the things that's a bit confusing is that there's all this talk about real movement on a very complex issue, and that is rules of origin and autos. But there's still fairly big things remaining when we talk about dispute settlement mechanisms, a sunset clause, supply management that the Americans don't like. I mean, there's still other big obstacles, are there not?
Well, there are, but arguably the most complex and certainly the most economically visible is automobiles and rules of origin. And so if that nut can be cracked, and it is very close to being so, thanks to some good work by all three nations, then we're really on the road to some fantastic progress over a remarkably short period of time. Having said that, I want to caution all the listeners that there's still some work to be done. Okay,
Aaron O'Toole, what are you watching for as you see these reports out of Washington?
Well, I think they're good. As you know, Martin, we're trying to be supportive of the government's efforts. The Conservative Party is a party of trade. The NAFTA and U.S. free trade agreements were our initiatives. What I find most interesting is the Minister did talk about progress and how auto and auto parts will be core to finding success in a renegotiated NAFTA. That's exactly what the Conservatives said last August. That's what I said. The Minister, in her speech, did not even mention the auto industry. And what's interesting, the so-called progressive agenda that led the government out the gate on NAFTA negotiation now never gets even a mention. So the good thing is we're focused now finally on jobs, on the auto industry. The other areas are very important, but trade in North America really started because of the auto parts industries going back to the Auto Pact of the 1960s. So we're buoyed by this. We're glad that in January the government got focused and the Trudeau government started focusing on trade. So we're going to support them, particularly even more now that they're talking the language of trade.
Okay, Daniel Blaikie, when we get into this period, which people are calling as an intense 24/7 negotiation period, there's real, trading going on here. What do you make of, or hog trading going on? What do you make of? What are you watching for on behalf of the NDP?
Well, I mean, frankly, it's hard to. It's hard to comment because we don't actually have much information about the process. So that's part of, which you find odd about parties that are on the outside of the negotiations saying that they support government efforts. We don't actually know what the government efforts are. We don't know what the government proposals are. And that's been part of the problem with the way that Canadian governments of different stripes have been negotiating trade deals for a very long time. So, I mean, we're looking forward to seeing what the outcome is, but we think that having a more democratic process where Canadians can actually weigh in on some of what the government is putting on the table would be the better way to go. So we know that, for instance, farmers under supply managed systems in Canada would like to have a sense of what kind of offers are actually on the table and be able to communicate clearly to government what they think of them before it's announced as a done deal. We know that there have been problems with NAFTA over the last 20-25 years, like the proportionality clause that we were raising in question period today. That ties us to a high carbon future, but it also has consequences for debates about, getting a pipeline to Tidewater and getting a better price for oil. Well, if the United States can say at any time that they have a right to a large percentage of Canadian oil production, getting a pipeline to Tidewater isn't going to make much of a difference either. So there's a lot in this agreement that could and should change, and the problem right now is that we don't know what is changing and what isn't changing, and that's a problem with the way that governments of both stripes for a long time have negotiated these deals.
Okay, Andrew Leslie, I want to ask you a question before we get to another subject, but just briefly, it's a question I asked the journalists as well, and that is, a few weeks ago, we were all talking about an agreement in principle Are we talking about really rolling up the sleeves and having something to present possibly to the American Congress and to the Canadian people that is actually a full-fledged agreement? Are we now into a different realm now?
Well, one of the options is to go all out, and the other is to resolve those things which can be resolved. There's a variety of time constraints which our American colleagues and all of us are eager to have solved, because continuing uncertainty leads to even more uncertainty, which is bad for international investment. The good news is that the Canadian teams have been fully armed with all the facts. There's been good cross-party consultation and support. Vis-a-vis the progressive ideas, I'm glad to say that most of those chapters are very close to being closed or resolved in terms of the labor, in terms of environment, in terms of Indigenous. And now that the Minister and her team of excellent negotiators are focused on the rules of origin and automobiles, specifically, which is probably, as Aaron mentioned, the most complex of the issues to be resolved, this is great news.
Okay, I want to turn now to another subject, and I want to turn to Aaron O'Toole on this, because you were raising it, your party was raising it today. And that is reports that there were discrepancies about who knew what when in the now famous Jaspal Atwal affair. It's now been revealed that the RCMP knew 2 days earlier than they'd previously said that Jaspal Atwal, who is a convicted attempted murderer, was invited to functions during the Prime Minister's trip in India. How serious is that, the fact that the RCMP actually knew 2 days before they originally said?
It's very serious, Martin, because it contradicted what the National Security Advisor of Canada, Mr. Jean, said before a committee. I was part of the committee questioning him. He said he first learned, as the Prime Minister's lead on security, from CSIS on the 21st. The RCMP is now saying they knew before. But what it really reveals, in my view, is the Prime Minister's office. All roads lead to the Prime Minister's office, because Mr. Atwal himself, at the center of the controversy, said that when he was talking to the Liberal MP Sarai, about coming on the Trudeau trip to India, MP Sarai said, when I pass your name in, you may not pass security. Clearly, he knew that the PMO would be vetting the list. I believe the PMO knew that Mr. Atwal was a potential risk, and they decided to take that risk. And I don't think they shared that information with the RCMP, the Prime Minister's close personal protective duty, or CSIS. And hanging Daniel Jean out to dry like that, I think, shows that the PMO, in order to facilitate domestic politics, is willing to not share key information with security agencies. I've asked the Prime Minister to come clear on this, because we've heard conflicting information for months on this. I think they should appoint an independent counsel to look at this, to really allow us to get to the bottom, to make sure security agencies are all sharing information appropriately. Okay,
Andrew Leslie, as you know, this has been an issue that has dogged your government, and that is the details about this Jaspal affair. Are we ever going to get this whole version of what happened cleared up, and how damaging is this to still have questions and contradictory statements about what happened?
Well, there's a contradictory statement. Aaron asked the question twice of the Prime Minister today, and the Prime Minister answered extraordinarily clearly that the RCMP had admitted that they made a mistake. The RCMP admitted they made a mistake in the clerical filing of the information that was requested and provided. Okay. That's since been resolved. The situation's been cleared up. We would kind of like to focus the talks on NAFTA, on the 600,000 jobs we've added to the Canadian economy since coming into office, on the fact that we have the lowest number of unemployed in the last 22 years, and the list continues.
Martin, we know what they want to talk about, which is clearly not answers related to the Atwal affair. I said to the Prime Minister, I was surprised I was still asking questions on this, but the story keeps changing. Okay, That's why I think we should have independent counsel.
Okay, what we want to talk about is we want to hear last word from Daniel Blakey. Daniel Blakey, any thoughts on this? The questions still are coming up?
Well, what I think is clear to most Canadians is that this trip has been a mess from go. It's still not exactly clear what exactly the plan was, or what Canada was supposed to get out of that trip. Nothing substantive seems to have come out of that trip, except this huge mess where it's unsure exactly what happened and who was responsible. And I think it's incumbent upon the Prime Minister to make that clear. And what we saw in question period certainly didn't do that. So we're open to the idea that if the Prime Minister can't get his story straight, then maybe we do need to bring somebody in to help him straighten out that story and give Canadians confidence that they're actually getting a real answer to these questions. We shouldn't still be talking about this, it's true. But the reason we're still talking about it is because the government has absolutely failed to give an answer that will put the issue to bed. So if it takes bringing someone independent in order to finally put this to rest and move on to talk about the things that I think we all do want to talk about, so be it. But let's not be here another 3 or 4 or 5 weeks from now talking about the same thing.
Okay, well, definitely we promise in 3 or 4 or 5 weeks from now we'll be talking NAFTA again. I want to thank all three of you for taking the time.
Good point.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.